Okay, so today's lecture, lecture 19, is about finance and growth and the control of capital, which is, of course, always an open question. How do you control finance? So we'll end on that note, but this will be my positive part. Here, talking about, again, what's the functionality of finance. Now, last time, here's our keys. Finance, we talked about finance as money, the handling and creating of money. But this is an essential function of any modern market economy. That money is necessary, money has to be dealt with, and banks ought to be like a utility. Now, the other thing, of course, that finance can do is credit can extend money, can extend capital, can accelerate the process of capital accumulation, which is the driver of growth. So credit is important in the modern economy. So we'll talk about finance and growth today. Now, of course, there's also the problem of the other negative side, or one negative side of finance is the parasitism or the speculation. We'll talk a little bit about parasitism later, but mostly about speculation on Thursday. We'll say a little about modes of financing industry, who finances industrial growth and why. And there's geography, a little bit about the geography of that, but I introduced that last time, so it should follow pretty directly for some things I said about finance and geographic scale last time. We'll talk about financing nations and national growth, and the modes of that, the forms of that, and the hazards of that. In fact, I'll be talking about the hazards of debt all through this, because finance means basically getting credit, and credit means going into debt. And debt can be a good thing, credit can be a good thing, but debt can also be a hazard if you get too much of it. And then we'll finish up talking about the control of finance capital, and how finance can control industry, the state, and the people. Okay, so three big topics today: financing industry, financing countries, and the power of finance. So, financing industry. Industry and credit models of finance, consumer finance, and financial oversight. So, basic function of finance is to provide capital for industry. And that can be long-term capital, which is your investment capital, which is what we're usually mostly interested in these things. But there's also all that short-term commercial credit that keeps the economy, it's like oil in your engine. It's not very glamorous, it's not really driving anything, but if you don't have it, the parts lock up. So you have to have oil in a car engine. And that's what commercial credit does. And only when it disappears do you notice. When your oil light goes on and your engine block freezes up, then you guess I should have changed the oil. Credit capital. Credit creates new investment. As I said way back in the first lecture of this series on money. Credit creates new money, which is new investable capital in the right hands. That investment can make profits, and those profits pay off the loan. They pay off the principal of the loan plus the interest on the loan. Or in other forms of credit, it pays off the bond or whatever it is. But we'll just keep that simple. And we have happy images like this showing that productive relationship. Of course, neither of these people looks like a real banker. But anyway, that's advertising for you. And there's just this question of course, the rate of debt, which we'll talk about. If debt outgrows your profits and you can't pay off the capital and the interest, then you're in trouble. And there's always, of course, a question of just how rapidly you take on debt, and also the danger of bad investments. If an investment doesn't pan out, which it may not, because all investment is essentially a bet, a speculation on the future, even if it's a good investment. But there are a lot of bad investments out there, and then you can't pay off your loans. Now, there's two ways you can get finance, from inside or from outside. And we tend to think of all capitalists requiring loans all the time, but they don't. And this is true, by the way, for consumers. That a lot of business, big business especially, is self-financed. And during good times, normal times, and especially during the post-war era when John Kenneth Galbraith wrote his New Industrial State back in the 60s, almost all big corporations like General Motors and Ford and IBM were self-financed. They were financed out of profits. They didn't have to borrow at all. And that is still remarkably true, as Doug Henwood shows in his book Wall Street, published around 2000, that it's really a very, very small percentage. It's in the single digits, and maybe down as low as 1 or 2% a year, of all investment is actually externally financed for big corporations. Now, small business is mostly financed externally by banks. And small businesses have to get up and running. They don't have a lot of surplus, and they're usually operating on a loan. And I'm talking about things like your local boutique retail store. But we just saw it with Andronico's, which is just closing stores because it overexpanded too much debt, external debt, and it can't pay it. So it has to close stores and cut back. But outside finance is needed. It's always needed for commercial credit. Some big corporations are so big that they can do their own balancing of daily debts and daily shortages of cash flow, but small businesses and medium businesses never can. So they always need bank commercial credit. And then they often go out for bank loans, or they issue new securities. Now remember, old securities don't raise capital, only new security issues. And then they have to go through the investment banks, but of course there are no investment banks now. Well, there are boutique ones. Or you can now go through regular banks that have investment arms. And that's how you get your outside finance. Again, the question will arise of, the question arises of how much external, how much internal debt. I'll say more about external debt when I talk about countries, where that arises more often. Okay, credit and aggregate investment. This is a really dopey slide that I just made up at 2:07. And so I got some image of Superman, which makes no sense whatsoever. But that's all right, I just wanted an image. When you think about it, it's not just investment by individual firms that need credit, but if you think of the role of credit in the economy as a whole, in all industry, that having credit available and having credit freely available actually greases the wheels of investment for everybody and accelerates the rate of investment, or the I in the Keynesian equation, that aggregate output equals C plus G plus I, government plus business investment plus consumption. And I'll say the same thing about government and consumption. But it accelerates the whole of economic growth. And how do you find an image for that? So I thought of a snowball, but that wasn't very good either. Okay, now industry gets financed by finance capitalists who have an interest in that industry. And there are two kinds that there are generalists who just give loans or invest in everybody. But I wanted to point out that there are specialists who are traditionally linked to certain industries. And in American history, you see a number of cases. Today, the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley are the best example of this because they're so tightly linked to electronics. But there are specialist banks and lenders and investors, and this isn't just banks, investors, who are always investing in Hollywood. Hollywood has its own financial institutions. I just didn't know what name to put on it, so I can come up with an example. Do you know? Venture capitalists, I'll come back to that. Mellon Bank for years in Pittsburgh was the main financier of steel companies. And there were certain banks that had favored, out of New York, that had favored relationships with car companies, and so on, and so on. Bank of America, the development of agriculture in California, was the main agricultural lender, helped develop California agriculture as the greatest in the world, the most modern, the largest by far in the U.S., the most advanced in the world. And Bank of America was absolutely at the center of that. It helped grow Bank of America, and it helped grow California agribusiness. They're also regionalists, and in that sense, Bank of America was, in those days, a regionalist. It was a California bank. It was trying to grow California industries. It was investing in Hollywood. It was investing in agriculture. It was investing in real estate and construction projects. Like Giannini bought all the bonds, almost all the bonds for the Golden Gate Bridge when they weren't selling, because he thought the Golden Gate Bridge would be a good thing for California, for San Francisco development. That's a regionalist. And a lot, as I said last time, there's a lot of banks in big cities who are focused on the regions. In fact, they are often the only people focused on the region as a whole. If you look at the Bay Area Council and who backs them, or who does studies of the Bay Area economy, it's either ABAG, which is a government organization, Association of Bay Area Governments, or it's Bank of America, or in the past, not anymore, Wells Fargo now will do studies of the regional economy to see how investment is going, what's happening and what's doing well and what's not. And where you have cities like Baltimore, Detroit, or New Orleans that lost those kind of regional banks, they've suffered much more than cities that retain regional banks funding regional industries. Now, I'm not saying the banks are the only cause of the decline of New Orleans. A lot of other reasons why New Orleans' economy went downhill ever since the glory days of cotton. Okay, so, and Baltimore. But Baltimore's banks all got bought up out of New York, and it became a very secondary player. And that lack of local finance played a role in Baltimore falling farther behind. So that today you don't think of Baltimore as a very important city. But in 1850, in the pre-Civil War period, like New Orleans, it was one of the four great cities of the East Coast. It was right up there with Boston, right up there with Philadelphia. Now we don't think of Baltimore so much. Well, one of the things it lost was its financial banks. Models of finance. Okay, there are different ways in which industries are financed in different countries. And so I have to point out that the two basic models are the one that emphasizes more capital markets over banks, and that is stock issues on capital markets to finance major growth of industry. And that's the Anglo-American model, and we tend to have arm's length, even where we have bank loans, we have very arm's length relationships between companies and banks. They tend not to be as cozy. Despite what I said about Mellon and Steel, that's a while ago, and it's a little rarer here. Whereas in Germany, traditionally, or Spain, or in Japan, you get very close ties between certain banks and certain industries, certain industrial corporations. And that bank will back that company for years, for decades. Will always be there as their main financier. And also overseeing that company, helping that company out if it gets into trouble. We have a much more, like with our labor markets, which are sort of hire and fire and much more wild and free, so too are our financial markets in America. We go for the kind of wild and free finance, and so that money can move around quickly and so on. It's not tied to anything. And Europe has a longer tradition of what they call corporatism, where you have these sort of long, definite ties, and often regional as well as sectoral. Yeah.
So when you say Europe, you mean financial Germany?
I mean the continent. Yeah, Britain is much more like the U.S. on this, because, with London and a lot of finance. Now, that may not quite be fair, because in tradition, in the past, in Northern England, where you had the growth of the most important basic industries, there probably were regional banks in Manchester and Birmingham and so on who backed them. But I've never seen a good study of that. I've never heard anyone talk about that much. There is one very good book by Jeff Ingham about the financing of the British Industrial Revolution. A lot of it was self-financed by industry, because the London guys never invested in British industry very much. They were busy investing in railroads in Argentina, and in stock markets in New York, and mining in California, and so on, rather than humble industry growing up in Leeds. So interesting questions like that about national traditions, regional traditions, and the links between industry and finance. In Japan, in Asia, they have had pretty tight relationships, but it varies from country to country. In Japan, it's famous for its industrial groups. It's Keiretsu that we talked about once before, I touched on. And it does the same with its banks. It'll have these, this is a chart of them, you don't need to know that. It's a chart of interbank and intercompany holding within a Keiretsu group, and there'll be banks in these groups. And there'll be a trading company in the group. So they'll combine industry, commercial capital, distribution, and finance capital all in one group, all not only mutually supporting, doing business with each other, but often holding each other's stock. So the banks will buy into the companies might buy into the banks. Now, this isn't all Japan, but this was the heart of the Japanese model for many, many years. And it does seem to be holding up, according to Jim Lincoln and Michael Gerlach over in the business school here. Korea is different, though. Korea has a huge chaebol, which are these gigantic multi-sectoral companies like Samsung and Hyundai that do everything, from cars to ships to, sewing machines. But they don't have banks. Interestingly enough, Korean law does prevent the chaebol from owning banks. So they're either self-financed or they go out to a whole series of other private and state banks. And they have these basic state banks in Korea, the Industrial Bank of Korea, the Korean Development Bank, that do a lot of the industrial financing. China also has state banks, which it is only starting to privatize a little bit, but they're tightly controlled by the state. That doesn't mean the lending is tightly controlled, because the lending in China has really ballooned as the banks have gotten deep into the support of rapidly growing industries. But also, local government has ties to local industry and often self-finances local industry. A local government will finance local industry. It wouldn't go through a bank at all, although the local government might also have a local bank. And at this level, China, the central government, doesn't have as much control as it would like over the rate of increase of credit, which is extremely fast, and is what's behind most of these spectacular urban landscapes you see in China. Rapid, crazy lending for, just wild-eyed lending by local governments and local banks to local developers to build these giant skyscrapers and mega developments and so on. We'll see how that works out, but the chances are China's riding for a property bubble to burst one of these days again. It did, it's done a couple times before, but it looks like it ought to do it again. And, of course, these older models of tight bank control started to be undermined in continental Europe, mostly in continental Europe, but also in Asia, by this neoliberal era, the idea of liberalization, sometimes imposed by the IMF, as in Korea and Taiwan after the 97 crisis, and otherwise just adopted through the political changes, sort of the penetration of neoliberalism into the political discourse and the regulatory apparatus in Europe. So for both France and Germany, banks became much freer, much more interested in kind of not close relationships, but more wide open, looser relationships, and that's probably why they got in so much trouble with lending to Greece, Italy, and Spain. where you have this huge buildup of debt. A lot of it, like in Spain, was for hotel construction, was real estate development, also in Greece. And it's kind of ironic because the Germans now are saying, these Greeks are so irresponsible. They need to pay off their debts. Look what they did. They overspent. How, those Mediterraneans, what do they know? They're always wild and crazy. We Germans are good business people. But in fact, German banks and French banks were lending to these people, right, by the gazillion. And so they're just as much implicated in it as the Greeks, yeah. I'll say that again. Are there any countries whose banks aren't really liberalized? Yeah, India and China are both still pretty tightly controlled. But in Europe, in EU, they've all been going that way. That's true. Yeah. I mean, France owned its bank under Mitterrand and nationalized the biggest banks. And that's been a long process of denationalizing them, which is certainly liberalization and less control. So you're right. It's all going that way. I just wanted to show those different models. They're not completely gone, though. They're not gone by any means. Okay. Then there's venture capital, which is a model which is very popular, of course, was invented in Silicon Valley. It's become very popular around the world. You wouldn't say any nation was operating on a venture capital model, but there are countries all over the world that have tried to create venture capital pools. In Europe, France has tried to create one. Russia has tried to create one. There are attempts to imitate this idea of high-risk investment with rapid startups and high tech. And what venture capital does, it is a high-risk investment. You have venture capital specialists, bankers, who specialize in both certain sectors like electronics or solar power, or it could be in retail. And they funnel high-risk capital. It can be bankers, trust funds, pension funds, universities, who set some money aside for very high-risk, high-return investments. They give it to the venture capitalists and say, invest this for us. The venture capitalists have their noses very close to the ground. They operate in the milieu of Silicon Valley or other centers of activity, whether it's New York or London or whatever, Hollywood. And they're on the lookout for opportunities. And people come to them and they look out for opportunities. It's that, the ideas are in the air. And people come to them and they say, okay, we'll give you a loan, but here's the deal. You're just an engineer with a bright idea. You don't know the first thing about business. So we're going to set up the management team of your new company. We're going to put you in touch with a lawyer, with a legal firm who can incorporate you, set up the whole, set up your partnership, wouldn't be an incorporation yet, set up your business, and we'll bring in, we think you should have this guy as your chief financial officer. And they force these startup teams to adopt sounder business practices as part of the deal of getting the money. And then they give them their money, and then after a while, if the company is a successful startup, then it'll go public. It'll issue an IPO, initial public offering, on the stock markets, and then venture capital is out of the picture. Facebook is still not issued its initial public offering, which is supposed to happen, but they keep putting it off. So venture capital is actually very distinctive, although in the past, I'm sure you could have found local investors who were sweetheart investors or angel investors or certain small banks who did exactly what venture capitalists are doing today. But the huge banks are so institutionalized and bureaucratized and look for kind of steady returns that they're not that interested in this kind of high-risk investment where you really have to have your ear to the ground. You've got to know what you're doing. You have to be. It's very personal.
Is there any positive? Why would Facebook wait so long
to make it bigger, to get richer? Okay, consumer credit. Why consumer credit? Well, it allows you to buy big and long-term goods. It's almost impossible to save up and buy a house. By the time you can buy it, you're 68 or something. So it's a huge advantage to get a mortgage loan and then pay off after you're actually living in the house. Cars are pretty similar because they're very big and lumpy, big upfront cost. So credit makes a lot of sense. It promotes, and then from the point of view of the sellers, it's an advantage. It promotes sales and speeds up sales. The house builder doesn't have to wait 30 years before somebody buys his house. You can sell it right up front. And then you're rid of it, and it's a homeowner's problem. So in that sense, it's consumer finance is also industrial finance, which is why I have it under the same heading here, the same major heading. Consumer credit, like credit cards, now credit cards are used for two different reasons. You can use credit cards for a major one-time purchase. I doubt you'd use it to buy a car, but you might use it to buy a washing machine or some large consumer durable, or to pay a student loan payment that you don't quite have the money for. But in that case, it'd be part of that big lumpy loan that you're going to pay off over time. And most credit card spending is actually just like commercial credit. It's just smoothing your cash flow. You get paid once a month. Most workers get paid once a month or once a week, and in between you're buying things. And it's more convenient to have a credit card, but it also smooths out the flow of income and payments. Consumer credit can also be self-investment. That's what student loans are, building your human capital. And, of course, consumer credit also increases aggregate demand. When there's lots of consumer credit around, as we saw in spades since the 1990s, is that when your wages were stagnant, you could be upping your consumer demand in a time of stagnant wages by taking on more and more household debt. So consumer debt can serve at an aggregate level to pump up, again, the C in the Keynesian equation, the G plus I plus C. And they're also driving the economy forward. Okay, you're getting credit to build the new factories. The factories are pumping out cars. You're giving credit to the car buyers, and the whole process is sped up. And, of course, that's what capital wants, and that's what accelerates growth. Consumer credit is provided chiefly by banks through local branches, through their credit cards, through one-time consumer loans of various kinds. There are also big corporations discovered years ago that if they provided credit